part of the conditions of confinement. It doesn't prohibit psychologists from overseeing and supervising the conditions of confinement in sites that are considered illegal internationally. It doesn't prohibit psychologists from instituting behavior modification programs for detainees. It doesn't reward and punishment programs, which psychologists have been doing. So there is it was a very good step, but I think Dr. Goodhart, and I wish the other candidates would speak to how far we still have to go. But so far they have not been willing to engage in a debate about that issue.
And if it is eventually judged that these were war crimes that occurred in some of these torture incidents throughout under American jurisdiction, and there were psychologists that were present at the time, would it be your view that they also participated in these war crimes?
I actually spoke with the UN rapporteur on torture about that very question, and he said that being part of an operation where the operation commits a war crime makes the person part of the operation guilty of the war crime. One of the reasons that I'm running for president of the APA, and one of the reasons we support changes in the APA policy, is to protect our psychologists from being brought up on war criminal charges. And it's one of the reasons that we want to change the APA ethics code, which at this moment permits a psychologist to follow the law or military regulations, even when those regulations violate our own ethics code.
I should also say that the candidate for president, Robert McGrath, said, "I'm categorically opposed to the use of degrading and threatening techniques in interrogation," and went on from there. Juan?
Well, as Congress convened hearings this week on the Bush administration's use of controversial interrogation techniques, a new human rights report released yesterday has, for the first time, found medical evidence corroborating the claims of former prisoners who say they were tortured while in U.S. custody. The 130-page report, Broken Laws, Broken Lives, was published by the group Physicians for Human Rights. It is based on the evaluation of 11 men formerly held in U.S. prison camps overseas between 2001 and 2004. 4 of the men were captured in Afghanistan and imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, and 7 were held in Iraq. All were released in recent years, and none was charged with a crime. Teams of medical specialists conducted physical and psychological tests on the former prisoners, including exams intended to assess if they were lying.
In a statement accompanying the report, retired Major General Antonio Taguba, who led the Army's first official investigation on Abu Ghraib, said the new evidence suggested a systematic regime of torture inside U.S.-run prison camps. Dr. Alan Keller is a medical expert for the Physicians for Human Rights study. He evaluated 5 of the prisoners, co-wrote the report. He's director of the Bellevue NYU Program for Survivors of Torture, joining us also here in our Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Dr. Keller, tell us about the 5 people you interviewed. What did you find?
Well, I can even speak to the broader, all 11. My colleagues and I, and in each evaluation we did, we had both a medical and a mental health professional conduct detailed evaluations over the course of 2 days. And what we found was clear evidence of physical and psychological abuse, and with devastating health consequences. Individuals reported being exposed to a variety of torture and abusive methods, including beatings, prolonged exposure to extremes of cold and heat, sexual humiliations, forced isolation, standing for extended periods, and with devastating health consequences. And I think, as was alluded to earlier, there is a profound disconnect between these sanitized terms, such as enhanced interrogation techniques, torture light, whatever you want to call it, it's torture, and we shouldn't be doing it. And when we examined these individuals, we found clear evidence, both physical and psychological, of what they endured. And as a result of what they endured, they had lasting physical and psychological scars.
How did you examine them?
So we conducted first detailed interviews, including a past, medical and psychological history, trying to assess what their baseline was prior to their imprisonment. Then a detailed history of the reports of abuse that they described. Subsequently, psychological evaluations were conducted, and then physical examinations were done, and then when needed, radiographic studies were done. So very intensive evaluations done in accordance with international protocols, particularly the Istanbul Protocol. And so what the evidence that we found was clear, whether it was scars consistent with having been shackled in painful positions, or descriptions of nightmares, of continued profound feelings of humiliation. So the pain and suffering continues long after the abuse stopped.
The report, some of the men you mentioned, portions of what they have suffered have come out in different reports in the past, but I don't think the detail and the extent that you have. I just want to read a couple of graphs from some of the individuals you mentioned. One was Amir, a salesman in the Middle East who was captured in Iraq in 2003. Besides the sleep deprivation and the other things you also mentioned, I want to read this part. He says, at first he was not mistreated, but then was subjected to religious and sexual humiliation, hooding, sleep deprivation, restraint, so on. He says, Amir recalled experiencing he was placed in a foul-smelling room and forced to lay down in urine, and while he was hit and kicked on his back and side, Amir was then sodomized with a broomstick and forced to howl like a dog while a soldier urinated on him. After a soldier stepped on his genitals, he fainted. In July 2004, he was transferred to the prison at Camp Bucca, where he reported no abuse. And then this was at Abu Ghraib that this happened. Another prisoner, Yusuf, who was captured in Afghanistan, talked about being subjected to electric shock from a generator, feeling as, quote, as if my veins were being pulled out. So this was really not only borderline examples of torture, this was actual physical torture that was occurring here against some of these men.
Well, absolutely. And it's important, though, to note you don't necessarily have to lay a glove on someone for it to be torture. Sleep deprivation, all of these, quote, enhanced interrogation methods have devastating health consequences. And regarding the testimony of those individuals and the information we got, I think several things also speak to their credibility. They were very forthcoming with us about when they were treated well, when they were not, what physical and psychological symptoms they did have and did not. And we're forthcoming about even, scars of saying, oh, this was unrelated to my abuse. You also assess their affect during the evaluations, and then based on the physical and psychological evaluations, you make an assessment. My colleagues and I who conducted these evaluations have years of experience in doing such evaluations. And so we were highly confident of the credibility of these individuals and the pain and suffering that resulted from their torture and abuse.
Dr. Alan Keller, how did it compare? You've treated people from 80 countries for torture. How did these prisoners compare who were tortured in U.S. custody?
The forms of abuse that we learned of, that we documented, are as bad, if not worse, than any I've heard from anywhere around the world. We arguably, tragically, are second to none in these techniques that have been used. It doesn't mean that in countries it's not used with much greater frequency. But I think this has actually really important ramifications. It's important to note that most torture survivors around the world are not terrorist suspects. They're civilians. They're Tibetan monks speaking out for freedom in Tibet. They're African student activists peacefully promoting democracy. And we have made the world a much more dangerous place for these individuals by condoning these methods.
And the role of the American Psychological Association, how important do you think it is that they haven't banned members for participation?
Right. Well, first, I'm a member of the American College of Physicians as a general internist, and proud that they've taken a strong stance in this. I believe it's crucial that the American Psychological Association do so as well. The notion that a health professional in the room somehow lends protection is ridiculous. And in fact, to the contrary, I think it makes it more dangerous. It enables the interrogator to think, well, maybe they can go a little further. And I think there are pressures on the health professional that, like, well, should I really be speaking out? And by the way, in our study, we did find several very disturbing reports of participation of health professionals, including mental health professionals, in the abuse.
We will leave it there. I want to thank you both very much for being with us. Dr. Alan Keller is director of the Bellevue NYU Program for Survivors of Torture. He is speaking about the report that he and his colleagues did, Broken Laws, Broken Lives, Medical Evidence of Torture by U.S. Personnel and Its Impact, a report by Physicians for Human Rights. We will link to it at our website. Also, Dr. Stephen Reisner, presidential candidate to head the American Psychological Association. That final vote will take place in October.